All right. Well, we are studying the places of the Bible, and we're into the Promised Land, particularly as it relates to Joshua and his efforts there. And so last time we got kind of stuck in the middle of the Jordan River and didn't make it out. But it was interesting to talk about all of the people who were important in the Bible who crossed that river pretty much in the same spot, and to think about that. And so that was kind of fun. And tonight we have two of the first battles for the Promised Land, the Battle of Jericho, and as I've always called it Ai, but more properly it's just pronounced I. But anyway, and then I thought I would comment a little bit on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the stuff that's been found here in the last, or that's been revealed in the last few days. So anyway, and we have folks joining us online. We have folks joining us here in the chapel. And so it's all good. Well, the city of Jericho has been a consequential city for a very long time. The people who are there now claim that it is the oldest inhabited city in the world. In fairness, there are other people who make the same claim. In the city of Aleppo, if it is still inhabited in northern Syria, and also the city of Konya in Turkey, as it's called. In the Bible, it's called Iconium. And when you go to the ancient part of Konya or Iconium, they'll tell you that one of the sons of Noah settled there in Iconium, and so that is their claim to being the oldest city in the world. But anyway, it is a consequential city for a lot of different reasons, and we're going to talk about that. But I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about, this is Jericho as it looks today, in part. I thought I would spend a couple minutes talking about what the Israeli Antiquities Authority just released here this week about recent finds. They've been exploring the caves along the Dead Sea right by Jericho, and they have found what are pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so I want to talk about that. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls came to Seattle, and that's where this picture was actually taken. I happened to serve on the commentary committee for the Pacific Science Center when they brought some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, if you went, we're talking little pieces about this long, little rolls, and I mean, a few tiny scraps is what it actually was. And then they had their lamp collection, and I personally have a better lamp collection than they had on display there. But anyway, I served on the commentary committee, which was mostly honorary, but at least I got to go to a free dinner the night before it opened, and to have my own little personal tour through the Dead Sea Scrolls. But they are very important, the Dead Sea Scrolls, but nothing has been found for 60 years. And so there's just been this long hiatus, and now we're at the point where some more pieces have been found, and these are some of the fragments that were found in what's called the Cave of Horror, because they've earlier found a number of skeletons in that particular cave. But these are fragments of the biblical books of Zachariah and Nahum. There's a scroll of the 12 minor prophets, and that particular scroll was found 60 years ago. But there were pieces of it that weren't with it, and these are the pieces that have been found and that they just released. And I'll explain why I think that's significant here in just a minute. In another cave, they reported finding this basket. And this picture shows a better version of it. But this basket, found complete with a lid, is 10,500 years old. and it was found in a different cave from the others, but still, and all of these caves are within, 15 or 10 or 15 miles of Jericho, along the shore, basically, of the Dead Sea, from Qumran on down into the Dead Sea area. And they also found coins like these. These are from the Bar Kokhba revolt. And the palm tree there is one of their symbols. But you can see some of the other coins there have trumpets on them, and the silver trumpets, that coin just to the up above and to the right of that other coin, that has the silver trumpets on it. But anyway, apparently in those years of the revolt, people went up there, or they buried people up there. That's why they call it the Cave of Horror, because of the people that were buried there. But they found these coins there, so that helps to date it quite accurately, because obviously these coins were only minted during a 3-year period and no other time in history other than fakes today. So the question is, why is this significant? I mean, it's all close to Jericho, so I thought it would fit with this discussion. But the biblical portions are significant because they're biblical portions. And along with the other scrolls that were there, other parts of the scroll, we have these substantial texts. And the largest one, of course, is the Isaiah scroll, which is, I forget how long it is, but it's pretty long when stretched out. And it's on permanent display at the Dead Sea Scroll Museum in Jerusalem. When they were bringing Dead Sea Scrolls to Seattle, I tried to persuade them to bring the Isaiah scroll, because it's really the gem of the whole thing. And of course, Israel is not going to let it out of the country by any means. So I said, well, how about if we locate a copy and have that? And there are 6 genuine copies, that is, on the same kind of material. I forget whether it's lambskin or what it is. I forget what it is. But anyway, whatever the material is, there are 6 of them. I said, well, why don't we get one of those? And I actually looked into it a little bit, and it cost $60,000 to buy one of the copies. And so I thought, well, no. And I would have liked to have had one myself until I saw the price tag, but it wasn't to be. But anyway, when you find, like the Isaiah scroll and the other portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is huge from a biblical point of view, because you're going back 2,000 years and finding an original, or a 2,000-year-old at least, copy of the Scriptures. And especially like with the Isaiah scroll, where you can look at it compared to what we have today in the book of Isaiah. Because one of the criticisms against the Bible, or the attacks on the Bible, has been, well, it has been, as it's been, copied by, monks over the millennia of time, various errors have crept in. And so we don't even know if the Bible is what we originally were given. And there are some groups who don't really believe the Bible, who often use the phrase, the Bible, insofar as it's accurately translated. They do that kind of bogus deal. Well, when you find one of these manuscripts this old, and it's the same as what we have now, it tells you that it wasn't mistranslated, that it wasn't miscopied, and so that you can have confidence that the Bible that you have in your hand is the same one that was written 2,000 years ago. Because, scribal errors have not crept in. That's the great significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so to find a couple of the minor prophets, in particular like Zachariah, even though the passage isn't necessarily, awesome. If it had been in Zechariah 14, it had been better. But I think it was like Zechariah 7 or 5, I forget which. But anyway, and just a couple of verses in this particular one here. But so the first significance of this revelation is that it continues to confirm the accuracy of the Bible that's in our hands today. It's confirmation of that. And by the way, there's a fellow by the name of Weston Fields who is the president of the Dead Sea Scroll Foundation. He's also a fisherman out of Alaska, and he has a small fleet up there that he works. But anyway, I had him speak here some years ago, and he gave me a copy of his manuscript, which is the complete story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's very interesting. So anyway, it's significant that way. And the other way that's significant is if I could just go back to this basket. So this basket was found in one of the caves there, 10,500 years old by carbon-14 dating. Now you can ask Chris in a couple of weeks what he thinks of carbon-14 dating, but still they established that it's old, the oldest item of its kind in the world. There's nothing older than this in the world of this type. And complete with the lid. I mean, and you look at it, it looks like it's barely been made, but it's 10,500 years old, and they found it in one of those caves there. So what's significant about that? Well, first of all, 10,500 years is a long time ago. I planted several hundred trees this last week on my property, and I planted like paper birch, for example, that it is it grows and dies within 30 years. So it's not a long-lived tree. But I also planted some bristlecone trees, bristlecone pine tree, which is the oldest living tree in the world. They can live to be 5,000 years old. I planted some, and I'd like to stay around as long as I can to see how they do. They're very slow growing, and they grow mostly in higher elevations, but I planted some just because you want to be optimistic about the future, right? I mean, I hope to actually just get to see the birch live and die. But anyway, so 10,500 years old. How is that possible that this basket could survive that long? Well, it's a function of where it was kept. You're down there in the desert, in arid conditions, in really closely controlled conditions, because it's in a sealed cave, essentially. And so it didn't deteriorate. Now, I have a friend who's in heaven now, Gary Collette. He worked for many years down at Qumran, 20 plus years, and he gave me a little bit of kind of like a jute or something like that, a little scrap like this, which he said came off of one of the baskets of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it's in remarkably good condition. But 10,500 years, okay, that's a long time ago. Now, why is this significant? Well, because of a story that's in the book of Maccabees about the temple or the tabernacle. When the Babylonians were coming in, Jeremiah was there, and they said, well, what are we going to do with temple implements and all of that? And so here is what 2 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 4 to 8 says. The book of Maccabees, these books, are in what we call the Apocrypha. I mean, that was in the original King James. A lot of people don't know the Apocrypha was in the original King James. But whether it's, equal to the rest of the Scripture, which I don't really think it is, it's still, held in high regard. But here's what it says. It was also in the writing that the prophet, that is Jeremiah, having received an oracle, ordered that the tent, meaning the tabernacle, and the ark should follow with him, and that he went out to the mountain where Moses had gone up. What mountain would that be? Mount Nebo, where he had gone up and had seen the inheritance of God. And Jeremiah came and found a cave, and he brought there the tent and the ark and the altar of incense, and he sealed up the entrance. Some of those who followed him came up to mark the way, but could not find it. When Jeremiah learned of it, he rebuked them and declared, "The place shall be unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. And then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud will appear, as they were shown in the case of Moses, and as Solomon asked that the place should be specially consecrated." So 2 things are mentioned here as having been put in a cave on Mount Nebo. And just to show you where that is, you can see Jericho right there at the top of the Dead Sea toward the bottom, and in red, Mount Nebo just to the right. Well, that's only a few miles from these other caves that we're discussing. So it's going to be the same climate and the same circumstance. So what you notice here is that Jeremiah says, okay, the Babylonians are coming, let's hide this stuff. And so he takes the tabernacle itself, and he takes the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and he takes the altar of incense. Those are the only 2 things mentioned, and they're put in this cave. And of course, my point is that those things that were put in that cave could very easily be in the same condition that 10,500-year-old plant-based pot or basket was. In other words, it could still be in mint condition, essentially, where it was hidden in that same cave, in that same climactic zone. Another interesting thing, that the fact that it's the tent and the altar of incense. When you go to the Arch of Titus in Rome, there are artifacts taken from the temple in Jerusalem. You know, Titus destroys Jerusalem in 70 AD. The temple is burned, but some of the stuff is taken to Rome, because he becomes the Roman emperor in short order. But Titus builds this triumphal arch, and on the inside of the arch, there's an engraving that shows the event of the capture of Jerusalem. And what they're hauling out, they show them carrying the golden lampstand, the menorah. You that have been around here for a while know that I had a copy made of that, a full-size copy, from the drawing from the sculpture that's on the Arch of Titus in Rome. And the other thing that's shown there is what I think is the table of showbread. And this table here in front of me, I had also made based on what is on the Arch of Titus. And Rich Jameson, who makes fine furniture, he's got a factory in Indonesia, and he had this made, or he made it for me and gave it to the church. And so this is a replica, and so we have this, and we have the menorah from the arch, but there is no altar of incense, and there's no Ark of the Covenant. And so the question is, did they not take those items and therefore post them on the sculpture there in Rome? And if they didn't, where were they? Well, what does the book of Maccabees say? It mentions those as being put in the cave on Mount Nebo. So that's interesting to me. But the second part that I underlined here, the place, that is where this stuff is hidden, shall be unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. And so that description to me is of the gathering of the Jewish people to Israel at the end time, because it's connected to when he shows his mercy, when God essentially rescues Israel at the time of the great persecution, the great tribulation. And so Jeremiah's prophecy, as recorded in Maccabees, is that those items will remain hidden in a cave on Mount Nebo until the time of the end. And if you read the book of Ezekiel, you'll discover that there is the re-implementation of these things. That's called the third temple at the end time. So that's yet to be future. And so it's very possible. I mean, I'm just saying that when you see a basket that's 10,500 years old, pulled out of a cave just like those, and it's in this kind of condition, it's not unreasonable to assume that what was put into a cave 2,500 years ago is still in good condition and can be cracked out and can be used. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's what I think about when I see this kind of stuff. Because it tells me that possibility exists. And I know that people say, the Ark of the Covenant is, in Ethiopia, and I have Discovery Channel too, and so I don't have the channel, I just have what's on regular TV. But I mean, I see those programs, and it's under the Temple Mount, and my friend Gary Collette that I told you about, he thought it was in a cave in Qumran. But based on this, I don't know. So it makes me think about that sort of thing. So what's the significance of finding the biblical scrolls? The Bible is accurate. That's what it argues for. And what's the significance of the basket? It's an indication that things can survive a very long time in that area. And of course, it's all right next to Jericho, within a few miles. And if you travel there, you'll see all these things pretty much all at the same time. So that's interesting to me. Okay, so back to Jericho itself, which is our general topic tonight. The city, as we started out saying, is very old. They say the oldest in the world. And, there's people that have argued that around Jericho is where they had the first domesticated animals, for example, like goats and things like that. And so it is a very old place. And it was a very old place when Joshua got there 3,400 years ago. It was already thousands of years old. But it has a lot of significance in the Bible. We talked last time about Elisha and Elijah, both involved there in Jericho, and Elisha curing the bad water, and so there's lots of Old Testament stuff there. This picture is taken in Jericho. That's yours truly, and Tasir Abu Sada. Tasir was one of the, soldiers for Yasser Arafat back in the day. And he came to America, worked in a restaurant, got saved, and now has gone back. And I think he's actually kind of retired now, but he might be living mostly in the States. But he developed these ministries in the same city where he used to work for Arafat. Because, Arafat, I'll come to it in a little bit here, I'm ahead of my story, but in 1994, the Israelis turned over Jericho to the Palestinians, to full Palestinian control. And so Arafat set up his a training camp, and he had a house there. And his police training camp was, in fact, a guerrilla training camp from which he could attack Israel. And Arafat, or this guy here, Tasir, was one of his guys that worked for him. And so it's just ironic that he's back and he has this thing called Seeds of Hope. This time when I visited him, looks like he lost a little weight there. We're in the restaurant called the Green Valley Restaurant, which is there in Jericho. And those are my grandson, Grant Gortz, and that gal, Jazzy Smith, on the other side. And but anyway, and by the way, pray for Grant here. He's developed a problem of loyalty. He's become a rebel. He just got a job with Lockheed Martin as he's doing his financial internship there, and he's not working for Boeing. And so I don't know what happened to him, but he's a great kid. But anyway, he's finishing up his work at Southeastern University, and And Jazzy's graduated, and she's communications coordinator here at the church. But anyway, I told you about Elisha solving the water problem down there in the Bible. It's recorded. Here's Pastor Jay. We're down at, you can see scrawled on the wall just above his head there, Seeds of Hope. But yeah, Tasir got a permit basically to bottle water. So now he sells Jericho water all through the West Bank and wherever else. But anyway, so there's a lot of history there and a lot has gone on. The city of Jericho also had consequence in the New Testament. In the New Testament, of course, Jesus had one of his great miracles there, and that was the healing of Bartimaeus. And his eyes, Mark 10 has that story. And I call it an explosion of faith because Jesus said to him, after he healed him, your faith has made you whole. But I think that Bartimaeus, sitting right here at the gates of Jericho, had an explosion of faith when he heard that it was Jesus. He wasn't going to be put off. He was going to meet with Jesus. And the Bible says he took his coat, he threw off his coat and went for Jesus. And that's what tells me he had real faith. Because blind people don't throw their coat. You know, you hang on to your coat because how are you going to find it when you're done? You know, but the fact that he hucked his coat over this way and had to meet with Jesus, he was serious about it. But what was fortuitous for him is that he lived in Jericho. Because a lot of the Jews that came out of Galilee, where Jesus did most of his miracles and had opened other blind eyes, when Jews came from Jericho, they didn't go through the mountains, up and down, up and down. They actually went down the Jordan River Valley to Jericho and then turned west and went up the hill to Jerusalem. So that's the route they followed. And so this guy, Bartimaeus, is sitting alongside the road where all the pilgrims go. Because, you know, they go there on pilgrimage. And if you're going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem 3 times a year, you're supposed to remember the poor. And here's the poor guy sitting there with his hand out. Say, hey, you boys going up to Jerusalem there to give alms and tell God how you remember the poor? You got one sitting right here. You could help me out a little bit, you know. And so, but anyway, he would have heard all the stories coming out of Galilee. And especially when he heard stories about blind people's eyes being opened, he said, whoa, this is me, you know, and who's going to open the eyes of the blind? The Son of David, the Messiah. And so when he hears that it's Jesus, he said, Jesus? And he shouts out, Jesus, Son of David. Jesus, healer of blind eyes, have mercy on me. And Jesus did. And he healed him. Well, that happened right here outside of Jericho, and it was a great moment. So this, what you're looking at here in this picture is of the modern day tell. So, you know, Jericho in the time of Joshua was about 8 acres. Okay, this property here is 40 acres. So this is 5 times bigger than Jericho. And until you've actually looked at the city, I mean, when they say, oh, they walked around it every day and then 7 times on the 7th day, who can walk around a city 7 times in one day? Well, do you think you could walk around this property 7 times in a day if you set your mind to it? I mean, 8 acres. The original property we bought here where the church is, and that, in fact, that high school and all is not on the original property. We bought 10 acres right here in the center. And you could walk around it in 10 minutes, you know, or 15 minutes easily. You've got to go through this ravine. That'd take you a while longer. But so it's small. And what you see, this brown mound here, that's kind of one end of what's left of the ancient city of Jericho. And when they excavate these places, you notice that kind of big hole dug into the mound there. That's a trench. And the way of digging is not to start at the top and just peel everything down, but you dig a trench through the middle of it so that you can identify layers. And because in these cities, the reason they're built up is because they just built one on top of another. And there's 20 layers here in Jericho that have been identified. And so it's just one on top of the other, and it becomes a lot after a while, and you want to be able to look down through all of them. So when they say they've excavated a place, and Jericho's had a lot of excavation, you know, they've probably only excavated 10% of it. So there's still a lot there that's never been touched. And that's the way it is on most of these places. This picture shows you this kind of that circular thing with the brown hole on top. That is the stone tower. And there you see another look at it, which they believe is the oldest part. They can't really identify how old or what it is. Some say it's a watchtower. I mean, it could have been a sacrificial kind of tower, because it looks to me, it's a little smaller, a lot like the one that's up at Megiddo, but they can't agree on what it is, and so, but that is what it is. So there's lots of remains there, and we'll come to a little bit later on some of the other aspects of it. But in terms of the city, what made it famous was Joshua, but there are some remains of other things. And anybody know what kind of a tree that might be? Hello? A sycamore tree, exactly. And why would that be significant in Jericho of Zacchaeus? How many can still sing the song? Yeah, exactly. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. All little kids like to sing that because they're wee little people, I guess. But that's Luke Lewis. We stopped there and take a picture of that sycamore tree. If you can't get to Jericho right away, just go out to the driveway here in the church, and those bigger trees on either side of the driveway are also a type of sycamore tree. So until you can get to Jericho, go out there and take a picture and call it good. And I suppose one day they'll cut them all down, because they're really kind of horrible for parking lots, because the roots tend to tear up the parking lot. So some genius 40 years from now will say, boy, these trees are terrible. And they don't even know what they got. Okay, and this is an interesting aerial view, interesting to me, and hopefully to you. Tel Es Sultan is the brown hump that I just showed you. You notice at top and bottom, they identify refugee camps. These are refugee camps that go back to 1948. Okay, that's before I was born. I was born in 49. So there are people, generations of people, that are still in refugee camps from the 1948 war. You think to yourself, what in the world? I mean, people move on. But the United Nations and you all, because you support the United Nations with your taxes, they pay for that. And it's ridiculous in my humble opinion. But it shows the city center of Jericho, and it's quite a populated area. When you drive through it now, this is one of the turns in the city, but you can tell it's just a modern Middle Eastern kind of city. This picture is from May 13th, 1994, when Jericho was turned over to the Palestinians. And there's a particular irony in that. This poster, it's our country with the Palestinian flag. Think about this. Israel turns over Jericho in 1994 as after 27 years. They turn over about 24 square miles around Jericho, and they turn it over to the Palestinians. The irony of that, in that it was the first city that God gave to Israel in 1400 BC. And now these millennia later, and there is a contest, obviously, for the city of Jericho, although Israel has no control over it at this moment. Although a time or two they've had to seal it off. There was a period, I can't remember when it was, in the 2006, 2006, 7, in that range, when you couldn't get into Jericho. The Israelis literally blocked the road on either end, and because there was just too much trouble in there. I mean, Arafat and all his carryings on. But it's also an explanation for why the Jericho looks like this in most of it. That's me with my camera there, and there's just some, I've been up filming some bricks. And by the way, if you look there on the table, you might recognize how similar it is to the bricks that are there, because actually somebody picked up that piece in Jericho, and it's a mud brick. And we'll show you a little bit of the significance of that a little bit later on. But in actual fact, this is in terrible condition. I mean, if something as significant as Jericho, but why don't the Palestinians take better care of it when you consider what it is? Well, if you're Palestinian, and this is the first city that God gave to the Jews, are you going to be celebrating that? I mean, they don't want to point that out. And so it suffers from not even benign neglect. I would say it suffers from malicious neglect. Let me just show you, this other picture doesn't relate to too much, except that it properly illustrates, or easily illustrates, the relative topography of the land. The city is way oversized there. It's because it's tiny, but it's an enlargement of the city down there, but it shows you the shape of it. Shows you how the Israelis came in, camping at Gilgal, then attacking down into Jericho. But Jericho has got to be the lowest city on earth. It's probably 1,200 feet below sea level. I mean, maybe at 1,250 below sea level. No city lower on earth, because the Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth, and I suppose it's at sea level is now 1,300 feet or so below sea level. But you go up the Jordan River Valley to the Sea of Galilee there toward the top, and it's 700 feet below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is way below sea level. And the Mediterranean, of course, would be where the sea level is. And this topography map shows that, I think, nicely. And the Dead Sea, of course, is down at the very bottom. And the hills on the right-hand side would be the east bank of the Jordan, and the hills on the left side would be the west bank of the Jordan. You hear the term west bank, you never hear the term east bank, but it properly is what it would be. That's the way it would look. And here we're up on the building that's owned by Tassir Abu Sada, looking out, and the brown mound, that's my wife and my grandson Grant there, and the one who's working for Lockheed Martin now. And the brown mound just above my wife's head, that's Jericho as it once was. But this illustration, I think, came out of Biblical Archaeology Review, but it shows that the city was in kind of 2 layers, kind of an upper city and a lower city. And when the walls came down, what this picture illustrates is you can see how they fell outward. And what that did in both walls, and what that did is it essentially formed a ramp up into the city. And so when the walls came down, they fall outward, and there's a ramp up into the city, and so the Israelis just pour in. The wall is of no good. And, you know, it's a small city, so it wouldn't have taken very long to conquer it. And as far as I can tell, no Israeli lives were lost in that assault, because God had done the hard work. But let me show you a little bit about the walls. The walls were built on are built on a stone foundation. So I don't know how high, but you know, maybe like 10 feet high, 8 feet high, that kind of height. I suppose it varied from place. And then on top of that, they would put mud bricks. So they'd build brick walls made out of mud on top, and baked in that sun. They're pretty hard. Well, the mud brick is something which is actually was used a lot in that period of time. And so this picture is of the arch at Dan. It's the oldest arch in the world, and it predates Abraham. So when Abraham went through Dan, he would have, very easily walk through that gate. And this is made out of mud bricks. This is my daughter Rosalind here in the picture, and she's the mother of Grant, who works for Lockheed Martin. But anyway, but the point there is to illustrate at Dan the mud bricks. Now, this is a picture of me, as you can tell, a long time ago. But I'm standing on the wall at Beersheba. The Bible says from Dan to Beersheba. But what's significant about this is why I took the picture, actually, had the picture taken, because obviously I didn't take the selfie, is that wall is made out of mud bricks in a similar fashion. And this is a modern, this is at Beersheba still, and this is considered to be the well of Abraham that he dug there. But now that's Pastor Jay, kind of looking at the well, and over there on the left, that's my son Zachary, who we had teriyaki with tonight. But anyway, you see the stone wall at the bottom and the mud bricks at the top. Now that's restructured. So that's rebuilt and redone. And this, so let me come back to that. One of my pictures disappeared. But anyway, I have a picture where I have my hand up against one of those mud bricks in Beersheba. And, they're about, when they're full size, they're about that thick, tall. And they're probably like this long. They're big. And I don't know if you've ever built with large bricks. The standard brick is like this, but then modern building bricks that are big are like this big. They're fairly big. But the mud bricks are even bigger than that. And so they built, so you have them. And I've seen them at Dan. I've seen them at Beersheba. I've seen them at Jericho. And so it tells you that it was something that was commonly used, and the style is pretty much always the same. Stone on the bottom, so people can't ram through it, even though they didn't have battering rams in those days. But they can't, penetrate it or burn it. And then mud brick on top, which is harder to reach. Now, the Bible, in describing the battle at Jericho, 3 cities are said to have been burned. And we'll come to Ai a little bit later tonight, hopefully. But the 3 cities were Jericho. They burned it. They burned Ai, the second city. And then the third city was Hazor. And that's the only 3 cities that are mentioned in the Bible as having been burned in the conquest of the Promised Land. And what's also interesting, that in all 3 of those cities, you can find the burn layer. They have found that layer. This picture I took from on top of one of the walls at Hazor, but Hazor is one of the cities where you can see the burn layer. And this, I took a picture. There's no perspective, and so you can't see a single thing. But that's the burn layer at Hazor. When I was there, the guide wanted me to have artifacts from the Holy Land, and so he literally took out a Ziploc bag, plastic bag, and took his pocket knife and poked out a little bit of the ash into the bag and says, "Here, take this. It's a souvenir." And so I can say that at least, I don't know why he did that. I didn't really want it, but I can say that I have evidence of the burn layer from Hazor. But I've never been to Ai. They've only recently, and they opened that, and excavated it, and they haven't opened it yet, so I've not been there. But here is some grain, or jars, that they excavated at Jericho, and there's grain in the jars, and the grain has been burned. There's a couple of things that confirm the Bible story in that. First of all, that it was burned. And so here you have evidence of that. But the grain jars are full. Israel laid siege to this tiny little town of Jericho. But how long was the siege? 7 days. And the city was shut up for a few days before that. So maybe 2 or 3 weeks at most is they've closed up the city. but there's grain, so they haven't eaten all the grain. I mean, you know, some other places, when they had sieges like that, they basically starved the people out. And there's some pretty gruesome stories in the Bible about sieges and what people are eating. But here the grain jars are full. Remember, when did Jericho, what time of year was it at the Battle of Jericho? If you remember from our study on the Jordan River. When? It was flood season, exactly. It was in the spring. So it was about this time of year. And about this time of year, they harvest grain. Because, you know, they have over there, like we do in Eastern Oregon, Washington, the winter wheat. And so, you know, the former rain, it falls in the fall. That's why I never go to Israel after November 15th, because you're going to get rained on. But that causes the seeds to germinate. And then the latter rain falls in the spring, and it allows the grain heads to plump up and to fill out. Otherwise, they're kind of emaciated. So it's important that you have rain in the fall and in the spring. Well, they had flood stage, but they had already taken, like the barley harvest, and the flax, because on the roof of the prostitute's house, what did she cover the spies with? There were flax plants that were drying. And so they had been harvested at that same season. So you've got grain, full jars of grain. So it's not a long siege, it's a short siege. It's at the time when their pots are going to be full of grain, at the time of the barley harvest and other harvests, because barley is one of the oldest harvested grains that there is in existence. I feed it to my chickens. But anyway, there you have that evidence. So this has been burned, seeds, at the right time of year, the right kind of seeds, burned at Jericho. And it's just more evidence of the accuracy of the biblical account. These show you some of the walls there of Jericho. You can see the mud on top. This one shows it a little better. Now you look down kind of in the lowest part, you see the lines there. Those lines are basically the brick lines. So it's like the mortar almost, but they've exposed that. But you see that it goes all the way up. And you also see that they're not doing anything to protect it. So they expose it, and right away the elements start tearing it up. And so these are other pictures of the same place. This is one of my groups. We're standing in Jericho looking up, and that's the traditional hill of the Mount of Temptation. I don't know if it has any actual significance, but anyway, that's right outside of Jericho. So let's read a little bit of the story out of the Bible, out of Joshua chapter 5. Now, when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every man straight in." And that is what happened. And here's Joshua 6. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it, are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent." But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, donkeys. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. So this idea that everything was offered to the Lord, was to be reserved wholly to the Lord. What's the significance of that? You know, this city, Jericho, was the first city. And the first harvest of the promised land was to belong to God. So there's a kind of burnt offering of the city itself. But all the gold and the silver, and you notice they also mentioned bronze and iron, because those would have had considerable value as well. All of that went into the treasury of the Lord. So that's essentially the wealth of the city goes to the Lord, and everything else is destroyed. No one was to take anything. No person was allowed to loot or to take anything for themselves, because everything belonged to the Lord. And that's the principle of the tithe. The first fruits belong to God. And so here is what, Joshua is establishing, that the first fruits belong to God. They're his. So don't you be taking any of that gold or silver. These are not coins, because coins had not been invented yet. It's going to be 800 years before there is such a thing as money per se. Gold and silver was by weight. Shekels were units of weight in the ancient time, but there was no money. Money was invented in Turkey. And so about 600 AD or BC. So this was long before that. So it's only chunks of metal, or maybe artistically used metal. They found in some caves up at En-Gedi some of these maces that were bronze. I mean, they're, like this, and they got mallets on the end of it. I mean, so they're pretty powerful weapons. So they were very good with metal in those days. In fact, when you read the book of Genesis, I think it's chapter 6, it talks about them working with metal in Genesis chapter 6, including making musical instruments. So they were doing some sophisticated stuff with metal by Genesis chapter 6. And certainly here, in the late Bronze Age, they had some good metal type of stuff. Now, in the tell itself, let's go back to that for a minute. It's been excavated a lot of times over the centuries, over the last, or decades really, more properly. Sir Charles Warren was part of the British Royal Engineers. He excavated in 1868, and I think that must be the first that I know of. And then John Garstang came along from 1930 to 36 and excavated there. Garstang in particular, and Warren also, they were interested in biblical things. And what Garstang found, because he was the first one to discover a lot of this stuff, to him, it confirmed the Bible. And the Bible is true, and so that's the way it stood from the 30s for a while longer. And, Garstang found certain kinds of pottery dating to the late Bronze Age, which is the time period of Joshua. And so for him, this is all good. I have a chart that shows what kind of pottery you get in what periods of time. So like my lamp collection, for example, I have a lamp from 2200 BC that is, I'll bring it one of these times and show it to you, but it came from Hazor. And it's got four corners. It's got little lips on the four corner where you'd lay 4 wicks in it, and it would draw olive oil out of the center. And then by Abraham's time, they had pinched off that, and so there was still one, but they had made them one-cornered with a round piece on the end. And then at David's time, a little different style, then Byzantine lamps and Roman lamps, and I have examples of all of those. But you use that to date the various periods. So lamps and pottery are the key elements and then later, coins and that sort of thing. That's how you date these various strata that are in it. So Garstang found a little bit of that Canaanite pottery, and so he says, yeah, this is the city that Joshua destroyed. But then in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon came along, and she dug a pretty good-sized trench, but she didn't find any Canaanite pottery. And so, and she said, since there's none of this kind of pottery, then this must not have been occupied in Joshua's time. And really, she set the tone from, let's say, 1952 right up until 10 years ago. That would have, as an archaeologist, she set the tone that Jericho was not occupied at the time of the late Bronze Age when Joshua was coming through. And so if you believe the Bible, then this is a problem, right? Because the Bible, according to Kathleen Kenyon, wasn't accurate in that subject. And so you think about all the people from 1952 until 10 years ago wouldn't have the ability to challenge that because, well, that's what the archaeologists said. They must be right because she excavated there. But a few years ago, a fellow by the name of Dr. Bryant Wood, who was an expert in late Bronze Age pottery, examined every piece of pottery that came out of Jericho. He went to various universities around the world that had pottery, and he says that he examined every single piece of pottery that anybody excavated. And a lot of these places, the stuff, it's in boxes in museum basements, that nobody's looked at since they got it. There's a whole lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. But it's there. Well, he gets permission, and he looks at every single piece, catalogs it all, and of course, what does he find? Canaanite pottery. And what does he find? He finds that the city was occupied in the late Bronze Age based on that evidence, which is when the Bible says that Joshua came through. And so, if you want to avail yourself of the information, you don't have to question the Bible because, archaeologists now note that Kathleen Kenyon, as smart as she wasn't that smart because she overlooked certain things and failed to take proper notice of it. So let's just kind of rip through this here in a little bit, next part in a hurry. Let's talk about the walls. The falling of the walls was miraculous, both as to its timing and that it did fall down. And I say that it was miraculous because there are people who want to explain every miracle of the Bible with some natural explanation. I literally was in Jericho one time. I had a Jewish guide, and he decided that he was going to explain the whole story, And so he said that, well, they crossed over the Jordan because there was a landslide up above, and it blocked off the river, and so they were able to come across. Well, great, that's great timing. And then he said, when they were marching around the city, they were marching in unison, although there's no evidence that ancient armies marched in unison. But he said, the tramping of the feet, well, first of all, in those kind of shoes, you're not tramping on the ground. But anyway, that's what he said. And it set up a vibration, and it got going, and pretty soon it started shaking the walls, and the walls fell down because of the walking of the people. So, I mean, but you see, the mindset that has to come up with an explanation. What's wrong with God knocked it down? You know, if you've never had a miracle in your life, I suppose you might want to go to the naturalistic. But I've had miracles in my life. And so I don't have a hard time believing the miracles of the Exodus. I don't have a hard time believing the miracles of the manna. I don't have a hard time believing the walls of Jericho came down at the blowing of the trumpets. I've looked at the bricks. I own one. I've seen how they fell. I've seen that the Bible's explanation fits perfectly with that. And so I'm good with it. That you don't need an alternative explanation. You know, I graduated from Willamette University back in the day, 1972. And my undergraduate degree is in political science. But to graduate from that university, you had to take one course in religion. And so I took the course, The Old Testament as History. Now, this will be good. And so, I mean, you got these various books, you know. And I remember one book, the professor, Professor Hand, Dr. Hand, he had been a Methodist minister, and he said his people weren't interested in this kind of stuff, and so that's why he became a college professor. I hated to break it to him, but he wasn't that interesting. But anyway, so he said, get this book, and so I got the book. It's called Rediscovering the Bible. And I said, oh, good, at least we're going to get a book that's on our side, you know. Except when I read it, you know, everything, it attacked virtually all of the miracles of the Bible. I mean, all the miracles. No, it's all, you know, other explanations for it all. I mean, the only thing it didn't attack, which is surprising, was the resurrection. But everything else didn't really happen the way the Bible said. And this was rediscovering the Bible and using the Old Testament as history, which, you know, the basic conclusion was you can't, you know. And so, but that's the liberal mindset, that everything has to be explained in naturalistic terms. I'll tell you one other thing. That was one of my most embarrassing moments. It was in that class as a university student. So I didn't believe the stuff that I was learning. And, you know, so I still took the course and got an A in it. So anyway, I had to write a paper on the Old Testament as history. And so I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to do with this? You know, am I going to give this guy what he wants to hear, or am I going to tell him what I actually think? And so I thought about it for a while. And I'm not proud of this, but I said, I'm going to tell him what he wants to hear. And so I unrolled all the trash, you know. And so he's got the papers, you know, and he's handing them back. And he said, I want to hand back the papers. He said, but I thought there was one paper that I thought was particularly good. And I'd like to ask Joe if he would come up and read his paper to the class. I mean, and, you know, they were all heathen in there except for one girl, Lucy Edwards. Her dad was a Baptist pastor in Portland, and I felt really bad for her, you know, and I felt really bad for myself, you know, and because, I mean, that cured me of that. I did not do that kind of garbage anymore after that, and I had a lot of fun experiences doing battle in my university days against, you know, I had a little bit of a debate with Madeleine Murray O'Hare on one occasion, and I would go to hear all the radicals speak, and I would harass them and stuff like that. So I've been kind of a troublemaker all my life. But on that occasion, I was not anybody to be proud of. So we have the burning and looting of the city. Let's just touch on that for a moment because it relates to the next piece. So don't take anything, it all belongs to God. Well, there was this guy whose name was Achan. Have you ever heard the name Achan before? Oh, you have? Okay. I mean, other than the Bible? Oh, no. I have. There was at the university, I ran for student body president and was elected. And one of the guys I elected in the primary, and one of the guys I ran against was named Aiken. Aiken Blitz was his name. Have you ever heard of Blitz Weinhard beer? Have you heard of that? Okay, he was to inherit that fortune. That was his family. But anyway, and the other guy was Dick Olds, and he's now a doctor, but that I ran against, and his dad was President Nixon's representative to the United Nations, to the Economic and Something Council, and was kind of Nixon's headhunter. And so he, rounding up the talent for the administration. But anyway, and so I thought it was pretty good because my dad was a pastor, and we were poor as church mice, and I beat all these rich guys, and I beat them in the primary. That is, I got more votes than everybody else combined in the primary, so I was elected, and I cleaned their clock, is what I did. But I had a good campaign, and one of my campaigns. Every bathroom in the entire university, on the inside of every stall, I had a poster. So everybody, at least once a day, I'm confident, was able to look at my face inside the toilet walls of I covered every bathroom in the university. There was not one bathroom that didn't have my picture inside of every stall. And I don't know if that was the reason caused me to get elected so well, but I think the Lord did help me because I actually asked the Lord to help me. And he did. Okay, so Achan, but what a strange name. Achan, who would name their kid Achan these days? It's like naming your kid Benedict. But I guess if you drink too much beer, maybe you name your kid Achan. I don't know. Maybe it's from your Achan head. But anyhow, Achan can't pass up the temptation. He goes into one of those houses, probably because a lot of that stuff would be buried in the floors, and maybe he's the only one in one of those little places, and he uncovers this gold and silver, and he found this Babylonian robe that was really cool. He says, man, we can't burn this. This is too cool. And so he puts it in his backpack and hauls it out and, makes like nothing's going on. Yeah, just my lunch and water back there. Don't worry about it. And anyway, so they win Jericho, and Achan hides his stuff. And Joshua, again, sends spies up to Ai. And they come back. It's just a small place. We cleaned the clock of Jericho. We can take Ai, no problem. Send a few thousand men. So Joshua sends 3,000 men, and they go up there, and it doesn't go good. They are hammered, and they got defeated. Israelis did, and they don't do very good, in my opinion, when they got. I think they just turned into a bunch of crybabies. So Joshua chapter 7, verse 5 reads like this: At their defeat, the hearts of the people melted and became like water. By the way, 36 people were killed on the Israeli side. Okay, that's a lot. But on the other hand, there was probably at least 1 million Israelis. This was not a small group of people. And if 36 out of 3,000 was a small force, that's what's happened. And this is what they're crying about. So at this, the hearts of the people melted and became like water. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, Ah, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. What a bunch of doofuses. Can you talking like that? Oh, Lord, what can I say? Now that Israel has been routed by its enemies, the Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? Well, so they're disheartened. At least Joshua did the right thing and goes before the Lord and said, why did this happen? And the Lord basically helped them to, he starts calling out, tribes, and then, family groups, and then individual families, until the only guy standing there is Achan and his family, and God says, there's your guy right there. And so, Achan paid the price along with his whole family. That's, I don't know how much gold and silver he got, but it wasn't worth it. There's just a whole lot of things that you can get it maybe, but is it worth it? And that would be one of those cases where it really wasn't worth it. Well, the excavations are taking place at Ai, and I'd like to just show you a little bit about that, and hopefully we can draw some lessons there. So Jericho, you see down there at the lower right, and it's called the Way of the Wilderness. And then over here you see the ascent. There's basically, from Jericho, 3 roads that go up into the mountains. One goes up to Jerusalem, one goes up toward Bothell and Ai, and the other goes down toward Hebron to the south. And, this map gives you a little better sense of it here. Well, so why do they go on this particular pathway? Well, first of all, it's the center of the country. So I've likened this to Sherman's March to the Sea in the Civil War. How he basically cuts right through the middle of the South and greatly disrupts it. And Joshua's strategy was to go through the middle of the country first in these 2 battles of Ai and Jericho, and then the southern campaign, and then the northern campaign. And so they go, and that takes, maybe 7 years, the whole thing. But so it's not quick. But so then the question is, why does he go this way? And the obvious answer is because this is where the road goes. And this next picture will give you an idea of it. There's a place called St. George's Monastery way down in the canyon there. And where I'm standing, that's a boundary marker. But the old Roman road passed right in front of that. And so that's the central road up to Jerusalem. They've got a slightly detoured around part of the Roman road for the modern road. But, for centuries, this was the middle road. But what I wanted you to see is look at the canyon behind me in that picture. You're not crossing that. And so you're only going to go where the road allows you to go. And the roads were put in the passable places. And so you don't just take off straight across. You go and these roads have been established for thousands of years. People have gone up and down these pathways for thousands of years, and so the strategy was follow the road. I followed the Apostle Paul on his journeys in Acts when he goes to Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and did you ever wonder why he went to that series of cities? Well, when I went there, it was very easy to see why. Because that's the way the road goes. There's a range of mountains over here, speaking about Iconium and Derbe, Lystra, and the road runs along the base of the mountains, and those 3 cities are just lined up there in a row. And so it's not, profound. It's simple. And so they follow the road, and they go up to Ai and into the interior. Now, this picture is taken from Ai, looking south, and I point out there the Mount of Olives on the left, and you can literally see some of the hotels of Jerusalem on the right. So we're talking, 9 or 10 miles, not a huge distance. But it's interesting, they say, so they burn Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. Well, the people in Ai could have seen the smoke from Jericho. And certainly the people from Jerusalem could see the smoke when they burned Ai, because it's like on the next hill over, or they're on kind of a level. If you were Native Americans and doing your, fires on top of the mountains, your signal fires, they would have been one here and one in Jerusalem, or one in the Mount of Olives. And so it's a strategic location. And this describes some of the way the battle went. So the first forces go up, 3,000 guys. They come out of the city, they trounce them. And why did they trounce them? Because God wasn't helping them. They had essentially disobeyed God by not giving all of the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron into the treasury of the Lord, and not taking any animals with them or people. No slaves, no nothing. All of that's gone. And so they disobeyed God. And when God was with them, the walls come down. When God's not with you, you go down. And that's what happened to Israel on the first go-around at Ai. They lost because they had been unfaithful to God. And so they go back, lick their wounds, get right with God, deal with Achan, and they go back a second time. And the second time, they had the full force, and Joshua sends a group of soldiers around behind the city, and then he feints a frontal assault like the first guys did, attacks the city from the front, and then falls back. And the people from Ai said, we licked these guys once before, we're going to lick them again. We're going to do the same thing we did before. And so they come rushing out of the city, and the Israelis just fall back down the valley, and the folks from Ai, the soldiers from Ai, keep coming, and then they turn around and realize that the ambush force was now occupying their city because they'd left it undefended. And so the same thing happened. The king of Ai was killed and buried under a pile of rocks in front of his city, and that was the end of Ai. And I don't know that it was actually ever rebuilt. I don't know enough of that history to know that. But this shows you some of the topography there. And this aerial picture is kind of good. What's called Kirbat El Makatir, or whatever that is, that's the down area. That's where the city of Ai was. And the up arrow is where the forces hid, so they're out of sight. And then from the north side, the Israeli troops came, and so they could be seen. But this hidden force is down in the valley there, and they come pouring out. And this is what that area looks like today. The city of Ai. But it does say, God gave promises to Israel and to Joshua. Said, everywhere you go, I'm going to give it to you. But the promises of God do have requirements on our end as well. And certainly, God said to Joshua, be strong and very courageous. Don't be a bunch of crybabies, for one thing. Be strong and courageous. But on the other thing, obey what I've given you. And if you don't do that, then you're going to be on your own. And if you're on your own, it doesn't go well. And it's why, by the way, I'm happy to say that in my entire life, from the time I was a boy till this very moment, I've always been a tither. I always give God at least 10% and always more. Because I just believe that, when God blesses 90%, it's better than 100% without God's blessing. Attacking Ai without God's blessing, doesn't matter how weak they are. You don't want to be that guy that does that. And so you give God his place, both with your wealth and your resources and who you are, but also you give God his place with regard to his commands, because he's the one who gets to set what the rules are. And our country needs to remember that. Congress doesn't get to set the rules, God does. Congress can do what Congress does, and the people of America can do what America does, but we're going to be on our own, and we're going to get the results that come from being on your own. It won't go well for America if they keep going the way they're going now. We need God's blessing. There's a reason why our forebears said, in God we trust, because God helped us. And that help, the help of God, is why America is what it is today. And when we lose God's favor and blessing, we'll be like the first force that attacked Ai. Won't be good. It'll be bad, and we'll be a bunch of crybabies too, probably. So don't be that guy, right? Be the right kind of guy. Well, it's a good lesson. Well, anybody have any comments or questions that you would like to ask about Jericho, Ai, or you? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, how old is humanity? Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I don't know exactly how old humanity is. I'm not an old Earth guy. I'm a young Earth guy, and so I don't believe man has been around millions of years or any of that kind of thing. But I don't know whether it's 6,000 or 10,000, and that's why you should ask Chris Ashcraft that question, because the date of 10,500 years was established through carbon-14 dating. And so ask him how reliably they can date something that period of time with carbon-14 dating. So that would tell you something. But at a minimum, you can say it's old. You know, and so if it's 10,000 years or 6,000 years using that methodology, I don't know. I just don't know enough about that subject of dating, carbon-14 dating, to be able to say they can establish it that clearly. But that's what the Israeli Antiquities Authority said. And by the way, you know, they released this information, and in pretty much all the articles I read on the subject, the director said, and we need more funding from the government to be able to continue this important work. And so what that statement really was to think, look, we're doing good here, and our funding is coming up in a couple of months. Be sure that our budget is well funded. Otherwise, this important work for all of humanity is going to be lost forever. The looters will get it all, and we will be the loser for it. And so I think that helps, you know, but that was about as transparent of a press release as I've read. Yes. The question was there anything in the basket? I think, I don't know. I didn't read any report to that subject. So I kind of doubt it, the way they're picking it up. And so I'm thinking it might have been empty. And I would think, just being in there, although the ground is very dry down there, so maybe it wouldn't have even, because here, if it's in the ground, you know, in 6 months it's toast. You know, I mean, I had some trees laying on the ground that they're kind of worthless trees, poplar type, but I mean, they were rotten in 2 years. So you could kick them with your shoe and it'd fall apart. But in that climate, so it's not like the Jericho jars that were full of grain, but yeah. So the question was, what was in the basket, the ancient basket? And as far as I know, nothing. Anybody else? I saw a hand down here. Yes. Well, so the question was, where is the ark according to the Bible? The ark was first in the tabernacle in the wilderness. It was at Shiloh for 369 years. David brings it out, and it eventually goes into the temple that Solomon built. That lasts for an extended period of time until the Babylonian captivity, and it disappears. When the second temple, or when Herod's temple was built, or really it's almost the third temple, but so they come back from the captivity, they rebuild, but they're all crying when they lay the foundation because it doesn't measure up to what it used to be. But it doesn't tell us anywhere. And so I have read some that say that even in Herod's temple, that there was no ark there. So it's just empty. I don't know if that's true, because I don't know what's there, because the Bible doesn't tell us anything about that. There's no statement in the Bible that says where the ark was after the Babylonian captivity. And so then you have this statement in the Maccabees, and you know, what to make of that, I don't know. And so, I mean, clearly a lot of people don't regard it as absolute, you know, proof, but it's interesting to consider that. Yeah, but we don't know what was in the Holy of Holies in Herod's temple when the veil was rent, because there's nothing that ever says what was in it. And I, you know, like people like Josephus and that, I'm quite certain there's nothing there that says there, you know, speaks to the ark itself. So, I mean, maybe somebody who would want to research that subject and find out exactly, but I don't believe there's any mention of it after the Babylonian captivity. We got maybe time for one more, if you have one more. And you don't. Let's all stand. Thanks for coming out. So we'll fight a few more wars next week, God willing. And we're still around. Let us pray. Father God, we thank you so much for being with us, for watching over our lives. Help us, Lord, to live our lives in such a way that it's pleasing to you and that we do not disobey you or live selfishly, but always live in light of the coming of the Lord and the restoration of all things one day. Bless your people tonight, Lord. Let your peace be upon each one. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you all.